budgets generally fall into certain broad categories. The biggest category is the merit budget. In almost every case, this is where managers are definitely involved. Managers know their people. From the time they were hired, the manager has to approve the salary offer because it's their budget. And the merit increases is no different. The manager has to approve the merit increase. We give managers budgets for merit increases. They tend to allocate those budgets, somewhat evenly, but some get more, some get less, right? We give them guidance on that. So that's the typical merit budget. If your overall salary budget is 4%, that might all be merit dollars. Or maybe of that 4%, maybe only 3.7 or 3.8 is merit. And the other small portion could be equity adjustments or promotions, that type of a thing. But merit would be the biggest, if not the entire budget, salary budget. Okay, and we give it to managers. These other categories would be managed a little differently and may not be given to managers to spend as they wish. For example, promotional increases. Sometimes the company has its own promotional increase budget, separate from merit. So they may say merit has a 3.6 budget, promotions have a 0.8 budget. Okay, so it could be separate like that. And in those cases, often the company has a nomination process of who will get promoted. Those nominations get debated, managers make their case, certain promotions get approved, and the manager then, when they do the merit process and they allocate merit dollars, would also have possibly a designated promotional budget to use for those people in the group who are getting promoted. There's other companies, however, where there is no promotional budget. Okay. And in that case, the managers have to use merit dollars to pay for promotional increases also. And that's really tough when a manager has, several people getting promoted. If they have a small group of 5 people and one gets promoted, that's tough because the budget may not give the manager what they think that they need. Now, just out of curiosity, I'm going to stop sharing here and ask any of you to share. Do any of you have a specific promotion budget that is different from the merit budget for promotions? No? Okay, so finally all the CFOs in the world got together and decided no promotion budgets for anybody. Okay, I knew it. It's a big conspiracy of the CFOs. All right, so that means that in all of your cases, you give the managers a merit budget, and if they want to promote somebody at that time, it has to come out of the merit budget. Is that what you're saying? Okay, that's tough. All right. That's very common though these days. How do you manage it? I think you can manage it to some extent if you have a large group under a manager and only 1 or maybe 2 promotions, then maybe you can do that. But even then, the manager has to give the promoted employee something significant enough that it's worth taking on the extra work for that promotion. But usually it's not directly extra work for those promotions. Isn't it true that these are typically step promotions? Engineer 1 becomes engineer 2. Something becomes a senior something, okay? So there's a difference. There's 2 kinds of promotions in the world. If you have to simplify it, the first place I start simplifying promotions, there's more than 2 types, but the 2 basic types in my mind are vacancy-driven promotions and step promotions. Vacancy means JL gets a job as a chief HR officer somewhere and she's gone, so her position is vacant. and Lyman wants to take the job. And this can happen anytime during the year. So it's really not part of this merit process. Vacancy-driven promotions generally have a life of their own. They happen when they happen. Okay, so what's left is mostly step promotions. Help desk 1 is ready to become a help desk 2 because they're doing more than password resets and standard, stuff. Now they're doing more, complex things. Engineer 3 becomes a principal engineer. So this is typically the step promotion. So how big does the promotion increment have to be? Okay. In a vacancy promotion, Lyman backfills JL. Probably Lyman is looking for, 15 to 20, 25% pay because now she's going to be head of HR or something like that. Okay. Vacancy promotional increases may be much bigger and follow our 10 to 15 per grade, guideline. 10 to 15% per grade might be the kind of guideline you use. But step promotions, the work they do on Monday after the promotion is really no different than the work they were doing on Friday before the promotion. Engineer 2 to engineer 3 is really just a broad, steady rising over time in the complexity and scope of work. It's not happening like all at once. So these promotional increases don't have to be quite so big, perhaps. I've asked a couple of CFOs, why do they not have a separate budget for promotions? And they say, well, they really don't care so much about paying for promotions that were not budgeted because they also don't budget for vacancies. CFOs see a vacancy as savings. Do you see vacancies as the company saving money? The CFO does. Okay. Now, if you've ever made a business case to buy software for HR, you've probably said, oh, it's going to help reduce turnover. Or almost anything we do in HR, we say, oh, it's going to help reduce turnover. Oh, well, the cost of turnover, I found a formula on the internet that says turnover is equal to 6 months to 2 years of salary. The CFO thinks that's ridiculous. The CFO thinks that you save money when you have a vacancy. But HR, we have all these fancy formulas that the cost of turnover is 6 months, 12 months pay. That's how we justify spending money that's going to so-called reduce turnover, hopefully. But the CFOs are very simple. If there's a vacancy, you're not paying a salary because there's nobody there. So, so they don't care if a vacancy comes along, and I'm talking, let's say, vacancy-driven promotion. If they come along and there's nothing in the budget because they save money on the vacancies. So I think CFOs really don't see much difference between merit and promotion. It's all part of, money. Okay, now the companies that do have a promotional budget, it would be for step promotions. If it is budgeted, here's the formula. What percentage of people will be getting promoted, eligible? And what's the percentage increase, the average promotional increment? So if 10% of the people get promoted and the average promotional increment is 10%, 10% times 10% is 1%. That's your promotional budget, 1% of salaries. So that's a simple way to determine how much promotional budget you need if you're doing step promotions alongside merit. And even if you know they're not going to give you a promotional budget, ask for it every year anyway. And remind them that, this is how much more money you need. What percentage of people get promoted each year? You can go figure that out. And on average, what is the percentage increment? Is it 8%? You can go get that information and say 10% of the people get 8% increase. I need a 0.8% promotional budget, which is $50,000. And then when they say no, don't forget it, leverage it into something else. Okay, we also need to enhance this benefit for dependents, and that's going to cost about $50,000. And since I agreed not to have a promotional budget, I want to take that money and repurpose it for this benefit. Okay, But it's important to be able to calculate what promotional budgets ought to be if managers don't want to touch their merit that everybody works so hard for. Okay, so I'll just put it in there like that. Okay, catch-up budgets and equity budgets. So this would be cases where you've got some top performers, high potentials with low compa ratios, and you have a market gap. And so you want to ask for some extra money, which will be held back and not given to managers. You give managers the merit. Step promotions happen with or without a budget, but then you in HR, you look at the results. You know who got a 5 rating. Are they all compa ratio 100 at least? If not, you better dip into your equity budget. Your high potentials, are they at least a compa ratio 100? If not, dip into your equity budget. So HR should always know who are the most at risk. This is kind of predictive analytics. If you determine from looking at the past separations that a disproportionate number of people who left happen to be high performers with low compa ratios, then that would suggest that the next person to leave is likely also to be a high performer with a low compa ratio. Okay, so you can request a catch-up budget. It should be small but make a difference. Okay, you have a large market gap. When I was running Asia rewards for NXP Semiconductor, our Shanghai office had 400 engineers. And the CNB manager for China did an analysis showing that their overall salary market ratio was 78. Salaries were 78% of market. That's a 22% market gap. And I asked her, how can that be? Everybody should have left by now if pay is really that low. And she said, well, they haven't left because the last 3 years we paid mega bonuses. Ah, well, we agreed that's not a sustainable strategy, is to depend on mega bonuses to retain people. So we decided to ask for a catch-up budget. So the merit trend for China that year was 6.5%. So we asked for 6.5% merit, but with a huge gap of 22%, if the market goes 6.5 and we give 6.5, we still lag the market 22%. You follow me? Okay, if you just follow the Mercer number, but you have a 22% gap, the market gives 6.5 and you give 6.5, and you're like, yay, we followed Mercer. Yeah, but it didn't make any difference. You still have a 22% gap. So when you're recommending your budget, okay, this is big takeaway number one, you need to know your overall market ratio before you recommend budgets. Because if you have a 78% overall market ratio, you're paying 22% market below market. You need to know that so that you're asking for 6.5 plus another 3 or 2 or 1. That's what we did at NXP. We asked for another 3. So they got 9.5, 6.5 for merit, which was given to managers to allocate 6.5. The other 3% was held back in HR. Once HR could see how the managers did when allocating their budgets, and did they take care of those at-risk top people, then HR can dip into that 3% and say, okay, we're going to give an extra 10% to this person, an extra 12% to this person. Very selective, very selective. But that's how you use a catch-up budget. Yeah. So this is a really important tool to have. And this is why we do the benchmarking. We need to know the overall market ratio. Otherwise, we would never know that we have a big market gap to catch up. Don't be greedy. If you have a 22% market gap, don't ask for 22%. Okay, it won't happen. And they might look at you like, are you nuts? But hey, the market went 6.5, we went 6.5 plus 3. So that brought the gap from 22 to 19. We asked for an extra 3% for 3 years. So for this year, for next year, and the following year. So 3 years in a row, extra 3%. So the gap would reduce from 22 to something like 13, roughly speaking. You don't really have to totally close a market gap if you're able to attract and retain talent. If your turnover rate is not bad, what's a healthy typical turnover rate for white collar? 13 or 14%. Okay. If there's one thing I've observed over 37 years of doing comp and benefits since 1985, that's more than 37 years, is that white collar turnover is 13 to 14% normally, 13 to 14%. Doesn't matter what region of the world, doesn't matter what industry. For white collar, 13 to 14% is typical. It's much higher for, restaurant workers and call centers and all that. But so if your turnover in white collar is 16, 17, I would say I would raise that as evidence combined with your market ratio. If your market ratio is 90, you got a 10% market gap, and your turnover is at 16, 17%, I would say ask for an extra 1% of equity budget, which does not go to the manager, it stays with HR. And then it's allocated afterwards. You will be a super rock star, especially after the managers have submitted all of their worksheets. And you go back to the head of IT and you say, here's an extra $15,000 that we would like to suggest that you pay to this guy and this lady and so on. And they'll say, oh my God, this is awesome. Because they didn't feel they had enough money, and here HR is coming along with some extra dollars. So it's a great way to build bridges. Your HR business partners will be able to do that, but in some cases, before the invention of the HR business partner, it was my job to go and pass out the money at the end of the process of the equity budgets. Okay, and then there's mandatory increases. This would be minimum wage. Minimum wage increase budget should include enough for two groups of people. One is the people who are below minimum wage and have to be brought up to minimum wage. The second group of people are the people paid just above those people who are below the new minimum wage. Because once you bring those people up to the new minimum wage, you have a compression problem. And so these people who've got an extra 2 years of experience, you have to lift them up a little bit. You don't have to maintain exactly the distance that they had before, but you have to maintain some distance, or at least have a healthy distance for those who are the top performers. Okay, so that's a pay compression issue, not just a minimum wage issue. Okay, so don't forget that compression group also. Okay, so those are the types of salary increase budgets. Any questions on these? And this is just determining the country budgets.